Hi everybody. Well, usually it seems I'm stuck inside because it's raining, and then I do a painting for you. But not today. It's definitely not raining, but it's so hot out that I'm just staying inside and painting today. So what I have queued up is something a little bit more straightforward than what I often do. So it's not very conceptual. It's just a pretty straightforward interpretation of a fairly realistic scene. So there's some, always there's some imagination and redesign required. There will be here too, but not as much as usual. And so I'm hoping the somewhat more straightforward approach and problem solving will prove helpful to more people. I am going to do a little value study here because the one thing I do have to redesign from the scene is the values. There's a good story here I can see, but it's going to take a little tweaking to get it to work the way I think it should, and also color. So it'll be a good exercise to discuss value design, rearrangement, and also colors and complements, that sort of thing. Where we are is Ohio, my home state. And this is a road over the hill of which, and just around the corner, I grew up years ago. So this is Fairmont Road in Ohio, a little bit south and east of Columbus. Pretty rural even still now. It's beautiful there. And for Ohio, fairly hilly. A lot of the state is quite flat, but not here. So what I'm looking at, I think you can see, is in the reference photo, which I took from my car, which is not a great idea, but I did stop. I had a bad habit of taking photos through the windshield while driving, and that is not recommended. So I did stop because there was no traffic and took a couple of reference photos. This one, of course, and then this one. This I took earlier showing a tractor, which is very typical for the area, but I just like the design, the figure of it. But this is the sort of dominant scene that I want to use, and you'll see the sketch I did is pretty faithful to it. So as far as intentions, what I'm trying to do is tell a pretty straightforward love letter, really, to rural Ohio. Simplistic and straightforward. It's not a particularly simple and straightforward place, although it can seem that way. But one thing I loved about growing up there was things often seemed a lot simpler and more straightforward, perhaps, than they really were. But what I really want to convey in this is a sense of serenity, quietness. I'm going to skew the light to be more of an end of the day scene to sort of also help quiet things down. Less, I don't want to say jittery, but less active than a full sun, bright sun bleached picture would otherwise indicate. So this will be very early evening, a little bit of warm glow in the sky, some light forming some soft shadows still on the building, but not the deep, dark shadows that you might get if the sun was high in the sky. Yeah, I mentioned a moment ago that what this reference tells me right off, I like the story this is hinting at, but the overall sense of colors is a bit muddled, and the values are not quite skewed right, I think, to make it an interesting painting. I always think it's the artist's job to never to copy exactly what they see, but to interpret it. I mean, that's where the art comes in the artist's interpretation of the world that we live in. Obviously, we have cameras for one-to-one replicas of exactly what we look at. But yes, it's the artistic interpretation where hopefully the emotion will start to shine through a bit more. I talk a lot about value design in my longer courses, my online course with terracotta. For anyone interested, I think we're opening enrollment again. If you wanted to check it out, you can just go to terracotta.art. I have an online program, mentorship program. It has about 150 hours of recorded content, and then live sessions and critiques in addition to that. But in any case, in those courses, I talk a lot about, for me, what I think is maybe the most important thing in figuring out the painting before you start putting colors down on the page is a value design. So I don't want to go through all the different iterations because they are endless, of course. But this is one value design I don't use that often, but I like. And what's going on here is I'm going to collect all the brightest, the lightest, and the darkest values more in the center, the midground of the painting. Just very briefly, I talk about my theory of value design is that you can make a good painting that implies three-dimensionality and depth if you use two sets of three things: a foreground, a midground, and a distance. So those don't have to, obviously they're all connected, they don't have to be very distinct and separate, but if you don't want your painting to look like a flat, decorated, two-dimensional surface, anything you can do to imply the sense of three-dimensionality is definitely worth thinking about. So some nod to a foreground, a nod to a midground, and a nod to a background. And then I always design and build up my work with three distinct values: lights, darks, and midtones. So naturally, all of your light values don't have to happen in one spot. You can design, and I encourage us all to do that, a pattern of lights throughout the painting, as well as a pattern of darks. Most paintings, in my opinion, tend to fail because they don't have a well thought out or a functional design of values. They often sort of fall into the mid-range and look unsatisfying or weak to us, and we're never sure why. We use terms sometimes like muddy or murky. Really, more often than not, in my experience, it's just that they need a bit more value. So usually I assign the dominant values in my painting to either the foreground, the midground, or the background. In this case, I'm doing something a little different, and then I'm putting my darkest darks and my lightest lights, my ones and my threes, all in the midground. And what this value design will help me do is then use more midtones coming off the top of the painting and the bottom. So the one values, the lightest lights, will in this case be the house, mostly. There'll be a little bit of light on the roadway, I think. Midtones will be dominant throughout the rest of the painting. The darkest darks will then be squeezed and sandwiched around the very light tones here in the midground of the painting. So a pattern of dark, light, etc. Really very simple value design, but it can be very effective. It's just really important to figure this out before you start. Because watercolor, you don't paint the light. I keep saying this because it's true. People ask me, how do you paint the light in watercolor? Well, you don't, because the light is already there on the surface of the paper. Watercolor is a subtractive technique in that we subtract away bits of the light by painting the shadows that reveal the light and give it character and dimension. Sorry, I'm adjusting my AC. Yeah, it's very hot. So yes, in this case, I'm going to use midtones, twos, largely in the background, largely in the foreground, darks, largely in the midground, and lights largely in the midground too. So I hope I'll build up this interesting, compelling pattern of darks and lights in the midground of the painting, and everything else will be kind of softer, more general, less saturated, of course, less value, less saturation of color, and less hard edges. So all of the interest will go pretty much here in this pattern through the midground. The center of focus of any painting is almost always going to be where the lightest dark meets the lightest lights. The darkest darks meets the lightest lights. That area of highest contrast is going to just attract the eye of the viewer and pull them in. So it is pretty much this view I'm doing. I'm softening up the foreground. I'm going to add some interest over here by dropping in this tractor on the roadway, but backlit. I'm going to change the coloration of the sky. I want to keep it quite luminous light, but I think these dark saturated pine trees, the deep green, I want to use to both to the benefit of color, but also value. I think they're going to carry a lot of the dark values here. I will lighten them up as they get nearer the top of the page. And then the sky, I'm going to keep light and luminous, as I say, but I think in the yellow, very light to somewhat darker yellow tones, the deep saturated gray greens almost of these conifers, a little bit of warmth dropped into some of the grassy areas. And again, the lightest lights will be on the surface of the house. I think to make a more compelling pattern, I'll bring some streaking across the roadway here. And again, most of this will just be toned out, mid-tone. So hopefully there'll be an interesting pattern of lights and darks that'll pull the viewer's eye through the painting along the horizontal axis this way. It'll be a dominantly horizontal painting, so painted in the landscape or horizontal format. There'll be elements of verticals, of course, power lines. I do want to include a few trees, of course, bits of the house, but those will all be secondary. The dominant directionality and energy of the painting is along the horizon, or horizontal axis. So I did sketch this up, not 100%, but pretty close. Just trying to work it out. I just designed it on the page. It is much like the reference photo. I changed some of the trees around, I repositioned some of the stuff on the right, added the tractor, of course. And yeah, overall pretty happy with the compositional placement of elements. The key now is just to connect them all with color, but primarily with value. Yeah, I love to draw. I reference this a lot. It's fine. It's a great thing to do. I have no bad thing to say about drawing, except that if you're using these, your base drawing you use for your watercolors, I will caution you as well as myself to sometimes draw a little bit less than you think you might have to. I tend to err on the side of drawing too much. And it's not always a problem, but it can be because you start to fall into the trap of then painting by number and being a little too careful. You start to dilute the beauty of the fluidity of the watercolor if you're too tight and too strictured. So I'm always going for contrasts in my work, as those of you who follow me know. And I don't just mean lights and darks, I do, but in addition I mean areas of the natural world, the built environment, that's another contrast. The horizontal energies versus the vertical energies is another contrast. Darks and lights, of course, but also colorations, warm tones versus cool tones. And yeah, so all these things go through my mind when I'm working out my painting. So I do like some areas of most of my work to be a little tighter, perhaps a little more detailed, but that only works for me if they're juxtaposed to areas that are very loose, very washy. If you can get those two kind of modalities to work together in your painting, you've got something good. So, surface today is, I found this beautiful Whatman paper, watercolor paper I used to buy back in the 1990s and 80s. Went out of business, made in Great Britain, but I found a stock of it in the Czech Republic and bought as much of it as I could afford. It's a beautiful light surface with light. It's got beautiful sizing. I should do a whole video on paper sizing because, wow, has it changed over the years. Somewhat for the better, but not always. So anyway, this is a very old piece, vintage watercolor paper from the 1980s. It's a half sheet in size, so about 22, with the edges taped off, about 21 by 14, 15 in the vertical dimension. So it's very light, white surface, very highly textured. It's rough. I always prefer rough surfaces. They just take the paint so much better. I paint on a sloped surface because another tool I love to use is gravity. Painting fairly wet and allowing gravity to pull the paint in the direction you want it to go is just a thing I'm always urging my classes to do. I think we get into a lot of trouble when we just plunk our paper flat on the our desk or surface and are then somehow surprised when we end up with blotches and streaks. You're going to, unless you use a good amount of water, which I always recommend, and a bit of gravity just to get the paint to flow in the direction you want it. So I'm painting wet on dry. I don't wet the whole surface first, at least not for this kind of thing. The reason is because if I did, you couldn't hold an edge, and I want to hold the edge around the house, at least for now. Later on, it won't be that important, but it isn't that hard to do. So I'll just cut in around. I'm using a mop brush. This is one of my brushes, Thomas Schaller brushes from Neef out of Australia. I'll link them in the description. They come in all sizes from large to very small. They hold a great deal of water, but they're synthetic. They mimic the behavior of a natural hair, which is more typical for a mop, but they are all synthetic, so no animals were harmed in the production of these brushes. Which is all well and good, it is definitely, but that brings me back to the topic of sizing, which used to be all animal-based and was fairly disgusting and borderline or absolutely unethical for a long time. But modern paper production has gotten away from that and uses now synthetic or plant-based sizing. So yeah, I'm just a very wet, light wash of this pale yellow. This is a Naples yellow by Holbein. I want just this sort of warm glow around the horizon. And then I'm just using my Holbein mist bottle here to soften that hard edge of that wash, and just use gravity and let it just run down off the page. That's a very simple adaptation of the traditional Beaux-Arts style graded wash or French wash that I learned 1,000 years ago. But it's that traditional wash that we've all seen where we build up a bead of water and you pull it down across the surface of a page. You can make utterly smooth wash very simply just by using a bit of gravity and a lot of water. So I misted the top of this because I want a bit more light peeking through the top of the page, and also, again, I'm trying to get all the contrast and most of the colors to happen here in the mid section of the painting, the mid-ground. So I want the top and the bottom of the painting to fade away as much as possible. I don't know that I want it to be utterly white, although it could be. It's sometimes a bad idea to have real dark or real light around the edges of your painting, because it can pull the viewer's eye out of the work. But I think in this case I'm going to be okay because I'm not having an abrupt edge, just a very soft glow. Yes, so far so good. Yeah, I didn't do a color study, of course, first. I'm just going to hope that that yellow will be the right value. Watercolor does dry a bit darker or a bit lighter than we put it on. It looks a bit darker when it's wet sometimes. That can depend on the surface we're using. This is 140 pound or 300 grams, so lighter medium weight paper, which I prefer because I think the colors tend to dry more pure, more accurate to the way they look wet. I used to struggle along for years with 300 pound very thick watercolor paper, which can have a beautiful surface, can take up a lot of abuse if you need to scrape or scratch, and it can take a lot of glazes. So there's some advantages to very thick watercolor paper, but for me the downside was that I paint so wet that a lot of the times when I painted on very thick paper, obviously the fibers of the paper would get wet, and then over time, and not much time, but my paintings would visually fade over a couple of hours. Just the pigment would just sink down into the thicker fibers of the paper, and that was not cool. So I swapped up years ago to 140 pound. I just like it much better. It behaves and plays nicely. This edge of the land, the tractor, the roadway, the lawn, and then the roofs of the houses are going to be quite dark. So I want a crisp edge here, so I can't paint that until this sets up a bit more. It's getting there. But what I'll do now is just do a light sort of, I don't want to call it generic, but somewhat generic wash over the foreground, just to set some of the mid-tones. As discussed, I think all this light that I want to preserve here, this house I'm not going to leave pure white entirely, but bits of it. So it'll be pretty light, the lightest thing in the painting. I just think if there's no more real light in the painting, except here, it's not the best design. So I think I'm going to try to scoot a little drip of light across the roadway. It doesn't really need to be logical or figured out. The sun is really sort of behind us, coming at us at a bit of an angle, but I don't feel the need to be a purist about that. I think it's better to just design the painting the way you want. Put light in where it'll do you some good. There is in this reference photo a little bit of water from rain, I believe, that shows on the roadway, so it doesn't need to be there, but I'm just going to use the idea of that as sort of my starting point. This, I believe, will get much darker before I'm done, but I just want to get this foreground wash started. I'll just rough it in. So I'm using, for now, a little bit of jadeite green, a Daniel Smith, beautiful green. This is just cobalt blue, a little bit of mineral violet, a Holbein color. It's really a value exercise at this point, so colors are not unimportant, but they're not the critical thing that's going through my mind. This is some serpentine green, somewhat brighter green. I don't want to use a lot of really bright, jittery colors. I want this whole painting to look kind of soft and definitely not somber, but quiet, end of the day feeling. There's not a lot of direct sun. I mean, really none. It's very glancing sun, so there wouldn't really be any super bright colors necessarily. You could have them if you really wanted, but I think for me, for this emotional temperature of this painting, I want to keep everything a little bit toned down. I'm thinking here the best way to get that streak of light across the road, so I think I'm going to swap out to one of my Escoda flat brushes, 3/4 inch flat brush, and just drag a little of this cobalt across. Violet and cobalt mix. I'm sort of just letting all these colors merge because, again, I don't want too many crisp edges. Yeah, I think that's good. Would have been nice if a bit of that came up over the lawn. Since this is so wet, I may see if I can kind of pull the water out of this round brush and see if I can't siphon off some of that color to just extend that graphic of the light. Not that well, but it's okay. Okay, I want to hug this house on the edge a little bit with a hint of some distant trees. So I'm going to use just a cobalt teal or cobalt teal blue to suggest some very distant trees, but just not too specific, just a shape. And really, again, just to hug the side of this house. I'll let it just melt into the this foreground wash. It's okay. I really wanted that bluer, more teal. So I'm just dropping in a little bit of, and again, not really that much to change the color as to intensify the value just a little there. Just anticipating. I know I'm going to save this house out mostly quite light, so whatever I can do to kind of set that up, bounce the color, the value a little bit beforehand, that's all cool. Yeah, that's fine. This mist bottle is so handy if you have an edge you're not thrilled with, or if you have a transition that you want to encourage to happen quicker. You can control a lot of that just by adding some water and misting it away. So for the bottom area of the roadway, I'm going to use a light red. This is a Holbein pigment. It's called light red. It's really sort of reads like a pale burnt sienna. It's an earthy red tone, warm. So it's almost sort of a neutral warm, if you will. Again, the idea is just to wash out the front in a more neutral way, so it's not too aggressive. It's not too aggressive, but I think it could have a little bit more character, so I'll use a little bit of this cobalt on the roadway. This is wet and wet. Just playing with soft edges here. And a bit more green washed out serpentine, this sort of olive, somewhat fresher, but it's really more of an olive green, so it's not very assertive or aggressive as greens go. So again, all of that was really just to try to set the values. I always work my paintings up from the lightest light to the darkest dark, which means I start with the lightest tones first. The white of the paper, of course, will always be the lightest. Then I really start painting by adding my midtones. So the lighter through the darker midtones are next, and the darkest darks are the lightest things to go. Just assessing where I am at this early stage. Okay, everything's all right. Obviously more value is going to happen in here. I don't want to paint over this area very much, so I'm internally just assessing what I think I can do to wet and wet to help establish any more character that I think might be needed here. This is some genuine burnt sienna. I'm just dropping it in wet and wet along the edge of the roadway. I can imagine that might be helpful. I don't want this area to be too hard-edged or too overly defined, of course, but I also don't want it to be uninteresting or, for lack of a better term, bad. So I'm just trying to add some soft interest where I think it'll do me some good. Do not want to overpaint it though. Not used to working on this paper, so it's behaving fairly well. It's very old, which is a little concerning because older paper can get quite dry and brittle, but it seems all right. Yeah, I may go over this with a glaze before I'm done, but I think for now I'm better advised to just leave it. Let this dry up a bit and then start it on the center area. Mist bottle to just encourage a little bit more transition. One of the many reasons I love the rough surface paper is these color transitions from both darker to light or lighter to dark, but also from warm to cool or one color to another. For me, happen more beautifully on this rough surfaced paper, because very smooth paper, of course, the colors would run very quickly. The texture of the rough paper slows that down, slows the running down, so that the pure colors sitting on top of the paper have more time to merge and form these beautiful translucent little passages within the overall painting. I find rough surface paper, when I'm lucky, when a painting turns out well, looks more luminous than if I paint on a flatter or hot press or even cold press. There's just, for me, more luminosity, more transparency, and again, more of these really beautiful transitions that just can happen on other paper, but don't happen, I think, quite as effectively. But it's not for everybody, I know. It can look a little like the lunar surface. Different papers behave very differently too. Okay, so this has to dry a bit. We're getting there. So as far as the overall development of the painting at this stage, this is I'd say the bulk of the midtones are in. I now want to start thinking about moving into the darker midtones and the darkest darks. The roof of the house against the lighter sky wants to be dark. By rights, you could argue that this whole house wants to be backlit and darker against the sky. Normally I would probably do that, but in this case, I just don't want to do that. I want to save out some of that light. And I'm just hoping that works. If not, I'm sure people will tell me in the comment section, as they're very happy to do. These larger pine trees I'm going to paint in last. They're sort of in front of most things. So these slightly more distant trees behind the house are the next things to go in. There's a combination of deciduous and conifer pine trees. And these photos were taken, I was going to say recently, it was just a couple of months ago, but in the springtime, so all the leaves hadn't come out on the deciduous trees. Now, of course, you could change that. You can paint whatever you want, but I just kind of like the textural difference. So I am going to try to paint them like that. This is a new brush I got. This is one of those liner brushes that many manufacturers make, but Da Vinci makes some of the best. These are liner brushes, and I love them because you can lay them on their side. They have this fat barrel with quills that stick out at the front. This is a Casenio series 1599, a number 8. I have these in 8, 10, and 12. This is one of the smaller. But they're just brilliant for making trees. Because for me, the worst thing I can do is to draw every little branch and twig and leaf of every tree. Nothing can kill your painting faster. So this brush allows me to sort of imply a lot of these tree shapes without really having to paint too much. Particularly effective on the rough paper because you just sort of lightly drag these sorry, you drag the quills over the surface of the paper, and it makes these very organic, aerated shapes without much work at all. I have ruined more paintings than I can count, and I still do, just by painting really bad trees. So I'm not, my batting average isn't perfect, but these types of brushes have really helped improve my fail to success rate. So these trees I don't want to make a big deal, so I'm just making them fairly light, raw umber, and then dropping in little bits of that mineral violet to enhance some areas of leaves that are just coming out and some of the trunks and branches. Then I'm fading them out as they go down the hill and disappear into the light. I did it over there just to sort of try it out to see what this would look like, but I think the general approach is good. The pine trees are going to be much more fulsome and more darker, more fleshed out, but these, I like the contrast of these deciduous trees that haven't fully bloomed yet with the much thicker pine trees. So I want to use somewhat lighter color and lacier, more aerated shapes. I'm using raw umber because if these trees are sort of see-through, they don't have all the leaves on yet, the yellow golden glow in the sky would sort of probably bleed through them and make them look a little warmer rather than blue or gray or whatever. It's just a little thing, but I think it will help. So these are most distant. Again, the pine trees are happening here, will fall in front, and the larger ones will fall in front of all of them. So that is just to say I'm not being terribly careful about what these look like. They're really just sort of a textural thing that's going to be more in the background. For the trunks and branches that are visible at all, I'm using another one of my brushes, the Thomas Chalon-Neef brushes, but also much smaller. This is a 0. I think these are brilliant though. They behave a lot like riggers, more like calligraphy brushes, so they're quite just lovely to paint with. For those of you who are interested in these, they're fairly new within the last year or so. You can really only get them from sort of the source in Australia. Senior Art in Melbourne, Australia. Senior, just like senior art, but they ship all over the world and you can look them up online if you're curious. I think that's good enough. So I do want to add a small clump of pine trees here. I'm going to use some of this deep jadeite green, Daniel Smith. I want to do it fairly quickly so that it can bleed into the other trees here and there, just so that they don't look lost in space, but they look connected. Almost always, whatever tree I'm painting, I'll do the areas of foliage or pine needles first, The trunks and branches, whatever I think is needed, I will do after. So that allows me to bleed the areas of trunks and branches into the areas of leaves. So again, everything looks connected and nothing looks left out in the cold. So yes, I hope, generally I think that's working. You get a sense that there's some pine trees in front of some deciduous. They look different, but not so different, and they're all sort of joining up together nicely to form a shape, because that's what watercolor painting is, just arranging shapes. Shapes of value and shapes of color. Taking a small flat brush. I got these beautiful new flat travel brushes by Escoda. They don't need to be travel brushes, but these happen to be. They sent these to me to try, and I love them. But I think a flat brush will be useful here because I can maintain the edge of the house and then just connect up some more of those shapes as needed. So yes, everything wants to look spatially correct. So the things that are farther away are going to have a little less detail. Things slightly closer will have a little more, a little bit more saturation, little bits of harder edges. So all that's just going through my mind as I'm picking away at these trees in the background, knowing that they don't really want to be too detailed or fussy, so better to leave them just slightly underdone rather than overbaked. There's this really interesting clump of larger pine trees here. I don't want to paint them all separately, I'll paint them all together. So to that end, I'm going to use a little bit more saturation in color. I don't use black pigment. I'm not opposed to it, I just don't have it. But if you mix a deep red with a deep green, this is a jadeite, dropping a little bit of alizarin crimson into it. They're complements, of course, so they'll get quite dark quite quickly. I want to go for a harder edge here against the distant trees, but again, I have to monitor it that it not get overly graphic and make too big of a deal out of it, but it is kind of a big deal. I don't know if I'm loving this smaller tree brush as much as I should. I have another, I'm going to go back to this. what I love about these types of brushes, these liner brushes, is you get these hopefully really elegant aerated shapes against the rough paper, where a lot of air and light shows through, and you get more interesting edges. So to me, that's looking better than what I was doing. Doesn't matter terribly, except over in this area, it's sort of will. Your eye is, I think, going to go here a bit as these trees interrupt this big, glowy gold area of light. And compositionally, the eye is going to want to go there for sure. So I'm trying to rough in these areas of foliage or pine needles fairly quickly so that I can connect them with the trunk shapes as quick as I can. I can go back and add some additional detail or elegance to these shapes, but it's important to get the main shapes established pretty quick. Okay, I think these want to look a little more solid though, but I think some of the trunks will take care of that. I just have to keep moving quickly. Again, as these get closer to the edge of the top of the paper, I want them to fade out both in saturation and in coloration, so I'm mixing a little bit of the light red into them and using a bit more water so that they just fade out sort of organically. Not too abruptly, but effectively. Again, I can come back and add things here and there, but I think overall that's pretty good. Now, again, before this gets a chance to dry completely, I'm going to take a flat brush, very dark, almost opaque. This is a Van Dyke brown, almost no water. I just want to establish the major trunks so that these have a chance to bleed together. Then I can assess if I need to fill in any of these areas of foliage. So I just drag the brush right through the wet areas of foliage. It's all good. Everything looks a little more, again, connected and a little bit more organic this way. Yeah, you can see I'm going to need a bit more character and infill there, but it's all right. I'm just trying to establish the main larger shapes. This is just right out of the tube neutral tint. Sort of a deep violet grayish tone. Again, not for everybody, but I do like it. It's still, it's dark, not very pretty, but it is not very, it's not opaque. It's very transparent, so it allows a lot of luminosity, even in the darker reaches, to show through. So yeah, I'm just trying to design on the fly here this hopefully beautiful, interesting collection of pine trees. It's sort of working. jadeite is such a beautiful color. It has actual minerals in it, so it's physically heavy. And as it begins to set, these things happen. These little minerals float to the top and make these beautiful sedimentary, intentional blossoms almost. All right, the small mop, I'm going to try to add a few some smaller branches. Just with calligraphy. Some of them I'll be a little careful and some I'll be intentionally careless about. Just a nice mix of messy and a bit more controlled. This very small mop is brilliant for doing this kind of thing. If anything, though, it holds a little bit too much water, so I'm constantly pulling the water out so that I can get these little dry brush scrapey marks. Overall, I'm generally happy with the shapes. I don't find them finished, but I can come back and add finesse and additional detail as required a bit later. I just want to keep the whole painting moving. All pine trees, obviously, are not the same. But very often the branches tend to droop down as opposed to arch up the way many deciduous trees tend to do. Of course, it's not always that way, but just in terms of graphic signifiers, it is kind of a slam dunk thing to do. But I do like the transition from lighter to darker, from cool to warm. All that looks good to me. So generally speaking, I'm pretty happy. I'm just assessing the overall shapes of these and the level of detail that I think is needed and the level of detail that I think is not. And just trying to add a bit of texture and finesse where I think it's required. Most definitely not trying to do tree portraits for it to be overly accurate. I do think it needs another shape over here, perhaps even coming down over the house. This is what I'm contemplating, in which case I'll have to do much of the house first. And no, I didn't have this figured out beforehand. I had the idea that I wouldn't be doing that, if I'm honest. It did occur to me. But now that I'm in the midst of the painting, I can see that I think I'll need to change course a little and have a little of this branch droop down over the house. Not a big deal, but I think it'll be a nice addition. So I can still do that later, and I'll just feather those areas in together. Yeah, there you go. Overall, I'm pretty happy with that. Most importantly, the deep values are what's needed. Because again, this wants to be a pattern of dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, all the way across. To that end, I can see that these distant trees I put in I did drop some additional blue, but they still are a little wanting. It's not a big deal, but while I'm here, I think I'll just brighten them up. Obviously, they're far away, and you could argue, well, they're far away, they wouldn't have much value. And no, in reality, they probably wouldn't. But I always tell myself, I'm not painting reality precisely, I'm painting my painting. So what works in the painting is what matters, not what actually might be there or not be there, or which way the sun might shine, or that. Yeah, I'm always having arguments with purists who tell me, well, that can't happen, the sun wouldn't shine this way or that way, and I don't know what to say except I just don't care. Does it look good in the painting? Then it's correct. Now I'm being a little facetious. People have different ideas of what you should and shouldn't do, and what's right and what's wrong, or what works for them. And I absolutely defend everybody's right to believe, to feel, to do whatever they want to do in painting or in general in life. So there are those who are highly realistic and absolutely in love with the reality of depiction and sun angles and all of that sort of thing. And I say, God bless. I like the value, it's better, but the hard edges are not working for me, so I'm going to mist it. That should do it. Hopefully the softer edges will start to imply that those trees are much farther away, and the lack of detail. And if I have any good sense, I'll just leave him alone now and stop fussing, he says. Just trying to squeeze a little bit more tone up against the side of that house, which I know is going to be light. But I think overall, as a design feature, this is starting to look more balanced already. The dark against what I know is going to be light. The pattern of darks and lights here. There'll be dark under the trees along the landscape. Some softer shadows. Obviously the tractor I want dark, and then up here in the power lines. So I think I'm on good footing. To that end, I'm going to paint in, there's a mailbox, a little fence post, a utility pole here. Do I need to put those things in because they're really there? No, I do not. But I want to, because I think it's the juxtaposition of these sort of scruffy utilitarian elements with the more lyrical elements of nature that I really actually find quite beautiful. I've painted a lot of scenes in this part of the country, and I do get grief from some people who think, why do you put those ugly power lines in? Or comments similar. I don't know. It's not because they're actually there. I don't find them so horrible. I think the contrast sort of tells a story about the changing of the times we all live in, and I don't know. I find it compelling and a little more human, I guess. Yeah, I'm just winging it here, building up a little bit of value texture on the far side. I know I'm going to be needing some dark there to help anchor the rest of the painting, so I think that'll do for now. I may add a bit more later. So this is very common to see. Tractors driving down the road. I would occasionally drive one of our tractors to school, risking the wrath of my elders, but can't say I didn't do it. And yes, I'm sure there's a lot of tractor purists out there that will be telling me what I did wrong on this tractor, but that's okay. Have at it. It's really just a shape. That's what's important. I learned to drive on an old farmall tractor, it was ancient. It was ancient even when I was very young. It's from the 1940s, I think. But that thing was indestructible. And I should know, I tried to destroy it. So again, it's not a tractor portrait, it's just a shape just to add texture and value anchoring. And to continue my pattern of darks and lights throughout the painting. I don't have a solid plan on how I want to terminate these dark tones into the mid-tones. I think there'll be some first-class winging going on here, but that's all right. This idea of a pattern of shadows, I think, is generally all right. Again, though, I just don't want to imply that there's a strong sun forming these, that these will just happen by indirect lighting, which I'm not sure how happy I'm going to be with that. We'll see. All that said, I definitely need the dark value up here along the ledge under these trees to connect left and right. I think it's okay so far. The underpainting I did earlier, of course, helps keep the contrast at least to a minimum. I just don't want too much contrast. What I'm doing here is a little additional Van Dyke brown just to bleed in the shadows to the trees and dry brush them up so I don't have a funky little edge there. Do not like funky little edges. Yeah, not too bad. I think sorry, I hate people that start sentences and don't finish. I'm trying to talk, think, and paint at once, so I'm multitasking here. I think this termination looks bad to me. It's not horrible, but I just don't love it. So I'm going to take a little bit of cobalt and a flat brush, take most of the water out, and just try to scruff it up a bit. Just make a bit of a dry brush mark across, just so that that transition's a little bit more gradual. Minor thing, but I think it helped. I knew I'd be facing this, how to transition this darker tone down into these mid-tones without it looking too busy or too jumpy, and so far I think I'm doing an okay job of it. What I wanted to establish here was this anchor of dark, obviously this dark under the trees, and this bit of almost dark mid-tone on the far left to help set up this pattern. Now I'm going to tackle the house, then I'll finish up whatever in the foreground I think needs to happen, and finally I'll assess the tree to see if it needs any more. I may not do any more to the tree, the group of trees. I think they look okay. They could be a bigger statement, but I'm not certain they're going to need to be. Little things, there's a distant power line, which isn't all that critical, but I think just to help flesh out the story, we want it there. So this is just some pale raw umber, very pale. And then I do have some actual power lines, which you could ignore, but I'm gonna try to just dry brush them in. Just raw umber, almost a dry brush, completely dry. Little power lines. Somewhat minor, but I think overall they sort of are in dialogue with the trees and this different language, and they both visually sort of lead you into the distance, which I think is pleasant. It's a little bit of this Holbein lavender, which is a semi-opaque. Just gonna drop it into this wet bit on top of the tractor, because that deep green with the lavender is just a really beautiful little combination, and I like it. I think I'll use the same tone, but in a more direct painterly way to imply the inside of the cabin on top of the tractor here. Not a big deal, but just a little bit more character. Right. Now, the other thing I anticipated I'd be facing is how much of the white of this house to really save and how much to gently eat away. Good question. The light's coming from behind, more or less, coming up over the hill, so I think you could argue that the faces of the house here, little strip there, overall would be the lightest, which are very small. And then the larger planes of the house could have a little tone on them, and I think they should. I don't think they want to read as pure white. Now the question comes whether you want that to be warm or cool, and I think warm because I'm going to have very dark roofs in deep blue-gray, like slate, and probably cooler shadows. So I'm just going to use a mid-size half-inch flat, some raw umber, a very simple treatment to tone down some of that white. So I'll just have a very simple, warm, cool story going on. So yeah, I'm obviously leaving it light, but I'm just dry brushing on some marks to take away some of the pure white. Also to add a little bit of a hint of texture to give it a little character and a little bit of age almost. It's a really beautifully maintained old farmhouse, but it is quite old. So I'm not being specific, I'm not trying to paint in specific clapboards or anything like that. Just a little bit of texture with the dry brush. I think that's enough. I want to keep it quite light, so that does the trick. Now I'll start in on some of the cooler bits. Overall, I know from my little study that I want to keep it quite light. So the shadows, again, we're not in direct sun. They're sort of more shades than shadows. Want to be there, but definitely not too aggressive. So I think the key is to pick a tone that looks really good with the this pale umber, which is just a gentle, warm tone. So I think gentle, cool. Use cobalt blue, I think, with a little violet. I think this will be all right. Don't want to go too dark. It looks like it may be a little dark. Probably edging more toward violet is the way to go. It might look a little bit more like evening rather than daytime shadows. Very subtle. It doesn't need to be, I don't need to be so crazy about it, but I do want it to feel right. For all the light I'm trying to save here, there's very little white going to be left. It's so critical in your watercolors to figure out where you want to save the light. Once you've lost it, it is gone. It's almost impossible to get it back. I mean, yeah, you can do scraping and bits of opaque and all of that, and I don't have anything against any of those techniques, except to say that they almost never look as clean and fresh as if you just... nailed the values and maintained the light from the outset. If you can do that, that would be the goal. So this is a bit of cobalt that I mixed a little bit of violet in. It's something I normally don't do, but I think it was the way to go. I just don't want it too bright blue and definitely not too purple. And I don't want as much contrast, again, as you might get on a very bright, bright day. Often I will drop in bits of warm into my shades and shadows, but I think because of the time of day I'm trying to imply here, and also the physical size of these shadows, which is fairly small, I want to keep them a little simpler, a little more graphic, and I'm not going to go into any of that sort of fancy stuff. The deep value I have planned for the roofs, the shutters, and little bits inside the windows, I think will marry all of these mid-tone shapes up to the dark pattern, the dark and light pattern I have elsewhere. That is my plan anyway. Should work. Again, the shingles on the roof, I'm going to make a deep bluish gray. I don't really love to pre-mix colors in my palette, but again, because of the relatively small size of these areas, I think it's fine. So this is just a little bit of neutral tint mixed into ultramarine blue. Looks good, but I think it wants to be darker and less blue. So this is just a bit more neutral tint. I'm using an 1/8 inch flat, so if I get a few of these little skip marks where the dry brush happens, I'm okay with that. I think it looks kind of good, really. Gives it a little texture. Yep, pretty good. Really feels it wants to be a little more neutral dark rather than it's edging a little toward blue, so I'm going to drop little bits of this is a Van Dyke brown, so a complementary warm into the cool. Yes, gave it a little character. This roof's shape, of course, isn't as big, so I don't think it's as urgent, but so for this, I'm just using one of these smaller mop brushes. It's great for little details. This is ultra blue with a bit of neutral tint. Yeah, it's okay. It's pretty good. I'm beginning to see the whole scene fleshing out. Obviously, I love this scene in real life. I'm always a little hesitant to paint landscape scenes like this that are a little bit, I don't know, I call them obvious or a little sentimental. But I don't want to shy away from that either. I don't think it's wrong to be sentimental, but you can go a little gluey or a little over the top. So I'm trying to thread the needle and still make it a proper painting, even though it's hard because it just, there's so much of my childhood and all of that mixed up into this. It's hard for me to be completely neutral about it. Just a moment. This is one of these very small number 6 Perla flats by Escoda. It's a travel brush, just like their normal brushes, except the handles come apart and connect for easy travel. So they're very clever. But they've just introduced all these new sizes and shapes of travel brushes, which I love. I use them all the time. So if anybody's interested, you can go check them out on Escoda, their website, escoda.com. But I'm using this very small flat to imply these shutters. I don't want to paint them solidly. Like I'm very nervous that this is going to start looking too much like an illustration or an architectural rendering. So I do want to keep as much of this fluid painting as I can in there. And these kind of moves help. A bit strange, as many times as I've gone by this house, I no longer know who lives there. It's still there, of course, but I don't know who lives there. That smaller porch roof, again, is a bit of ultramarine blue with neutral tint, and then some Van Dyke brown on the edges just to punch it out and give it a little glow in the center, bluey glow. So just to continue the patterning of darks with the flat, I'm just going to add a little bit of deeper, more saturated tones to the far left. Because now we can really pretty clearly start to see the pattern of dark, light, dark, light, dark, light throughout the painting to see if it's still working. And it is. Needs a little character in the windows. But this is a place where we can so easily just do too much and also just get way too tight. One little trick I've learned is if you're doing a series of windows that all look more or less the same, just don't paint them all the same. Make one a little different than the next, just to give a little variety, just in terms of its patterning or shadowing or whatever, just so that they're not all the same. It'll just go a long way into making your whole painting look a little more fluid and fresh. Oh, the painter, my friend Andy Evanson, is really good at explaining that. He does a really great job of adding variety to what would otherwise perhaps look like repetitive elements in his paintings. So what I'm doing now is just adding value for the sake of the painting. I really wanted to do that in reality, not so much, but I think the painting needs a bit more deep tones through the middle just to continue the pattern. But I think we're in fairly good shape. The last remaining bit is the little porch out front. Yeah, it's looking all right. I opted not to add another tree over here, thinking maybe compositionally I should, but I really wanted to anchor the painting to the left and just allow this to bleed off. I think it's working. Another tree here would be fairly obvious, but I just didn't want to do it. I thought it would add too much foreground heft, and I wanted to keep everything pushed back. You could add another tree behind, but I really thought that would sort of start to weight it to the left and look a little bookended. So I've opted to try to keep all the interest just clustered here. We will see. It may not have been the thing to do, and I can assess it later. If it doesn't work, I can adjust it. But I think it's working. Right. Now, there's another little driveway I've indicated here, which again, not because it's really there, but I think it'll just be an element I can work with to help flesh out the distant midground into the more generic foreground, which I think still needs a little work. A little bit of this dark wants to come across here, definitely, and bleed down. So I think to do that, I'll use a little bit of this serpentine and a 1/2 inch flat, and try not to be too fancy about it, just a little bit of additional value, more value than color, but definitely a little color. This is serpentine green washing down into this light red. I'm going to stretch some of these soft shadows out and just let them bleed. I'm just very aware that anything I do from this point down has to be pretty judicious and will be very, very easy to overpaint, to get the foreground much too heavy, and I really don't want that. So I'm trying to be careful to add colors, value, and not detail so much, but just hinting at bits of detail, and really thinking about radically fading things out from here on out. I wanted to add this a little additional driveway because it just allowed me to add this additional little sparkle of light, not pure white, but light, to just help establish this horizontal pattern a little bit more effectively than I had done. This is just cobalt. I'm just, not indiscriminately, but just washing some textural lines across the roadway to break it up, to help emphasize the horizontal axis story. Yeah, looks fine. Now I'm going to swap out to larger 3/4 inch brush. I'm going to go away from the yellow and just into some, away from the green and just into some yellow. Which I hope will sort of visually connect back to the sky. And just a little bit of additional violet at the bottom. Overall, not so bad. I think a few little balancing tweaks have to happen. I like the way all this is resolving. I do think a little bit more deeper green tones up near the base of the house are wanting, but that should be pretty easy. I'm going to just punch them in with the side of this 1/2 inch flat. It's still pretty wet, so hopefully this will bleed down and all run together nicely and connect. There is this road sign here for some reason I added. I'm not sure I should have, but I did. So subconsciously, I must have felt it was a good idea. So that just means I have to address it at some point. So this is all fine, but I think I'm going to just mist this so some of this looks a little more, a little less specific. I can just run some of these tonalities together. A little water, a little gravity. Holding it up this way so the pigments run this way in the horizontal. That way I help maintain the value darkness along the bottom, but just became a little less graphic with some of the shapes here. Unfortunately, I washed away a little bit of my driveway that I worked to maintain, but I think I can reclaim that. Again, some later stage wet and wet work, just trying to help emphasize some of the horizontal character that I was building up without any hard edges. So assessing where I am, the overall question for me is, how do the values look? Generally good. I think this pattern of dark, light, dark that I've wanted has happened. Composition of values is what I had in mind, where all the darks and all the lights, the major darks and lights, are happening in the midground. The background, the foreground is all mid-tone and sort of non-specific. Beyond that, I can start to assess or critique technically how I felt I did, or if it's wanting anything. I can see as this dries, I'll probably add a little dry brush character to this sort of energy of this diagonal roadway. Just here, softly. I'll do that in just a moment. It's too wet just now. And I'm unsure if anything else needs to happen here. Everything in me is crying out to drop a tree in here, but I think it would be a mistake, so I don't want to. And now I'm assessing at this stage if anything more of this bigger tree shape ought to happen. Earlier, I wasn't sure if anything was needed. Now, I do think I want to flesh out these trees to come out here a bit more, and perhaps just a little over that edge of the house. This side I'm relatively happy with. This isn't particularly elegant, but I think I can add some filigree and detail there to make it look a little bit more substantial. And I think I want to add a secondary or another little shelf of mid-tone green up in here. So I'm going to use another one of these tree brushes. It's another Casenio. This is not a travel brush, but a number 6. So it's smaller, and I should have more luck in making some slightly elegant shapes. Good news is everything I did before is dry, so if I want edges or anything to look forward, this will help me get there. This is largely serpentine green. I don't want to use any of these heavier, deep tones up here. I don't want to use too many of these brighter greens, but I think a few kind of help. Just feather things together. It's all fine, but at this stage, it's just so easy to overdo it, where you think it needs something, but you're not 100% sure what, and that's kind of the worst place you can put yourself, because the odds are you'll do something that looks bad are very high. So it's almost better to do nothing than something that looks bad. But I think that was needed. But now I want to tie it together with some additional tree structures, branches, twigs, and the like. I'm going to use very small Neef round brush number 2. Doesn't matter what color, just a little bit of, this is Van Dyke brown just because it was lying in the palette. And literally like calligraphy, I'm just going to intuitively drag this through the wet areas, across the dry areas, adding texture, filigree, a little bit more finish to this side. And I will do the same over here in a moment. Again, this kind of work, it's so fun to do, so you have to also police yourself that just because it's fun doesn't mean you should do more all the time. But I think that's fine. The sort of contrast between nothing and then all this busyness I think is rather nice. But I think I'm going to step off and let that be. A little bit of the same character over here. I want to use it to flesh out the upper part of this tree. Down into the lower portions. Here I'll add a little bit of deeper jadeite green for some additional heft and value. It's all fine, but it's dry underneath, so you have to police it to feather it in so it doesn't look pasted on. And then here, I am going to just bring a little bit of this tree over the house just to help connect the shapes, I think. It's a bit of a habit I have, and it's not to say it's a bad habit, but it doesn't mean it's always right. But I love to layer things over. It just helps. Again, another thing you can do pretty easily to help emphasize the sense of three-dimensionality. That's enough. Same story, the little tiny round brush, I'm going to scrape in some scented branches. How are we down here? It's still pretty wet. Oh good, that gives me more time to completely ruin the top of the painting. really love painting trees. Which is good, but it's hard to stop. And so it's so easy to overpaint them. I think we'll call that a day. I think we'll call this done. I like everything that's there. I'm just assessing what else it needs, if anything. Definitely a little bit of character lines through this mid-tone area. Yeah, I am mourning the loss of that little bit of light there. I'm wondering if I could reclaim it a bit. That could end badly, but it's worth a try. So sometimes to do that, you can take an acrylic brush, I think works, well, anything, but an acrylic brush because it's fairly stiff. It doesn't have a lot of water. I moisten it, take a lot of the water out. Then you can push it down fairly hard. It's not quite the same as scrubbing it, but it is sort of lifting. It doesn't have the neat edge that I once had, but I think I could reclaim that when that dries. And yeah, that should do the trick. This needs just another minute. I may have to get the hairdryer. Okay. So I think a couple more moves and I'm going to call this done. I do want a little bit of dry brush up here around the bottom of the house with just some deep green. Both additional value and also sort of graphic interest, just to help keep the eyes centered up here a bit more. I'm okay with this. I think a little bit of work just here. Again, for some reason I saved this road sign. I'm not sure why. I don't know that it really wants to or needs to be there, but I don't feel like taking it out, so I'm going to use it. I'm going to leave it completely white, even though that may be counterintuitive. That's what I'm doing. Sticking to it. Then here, this little bit of grass and roadway to the side. I wanted to have a secondary bit of contrast and interest, but not as much as what's going on up here, so I should be clever enough to do that. The key here is just not to go too bright or too dark. 1/2 inch flat just to keep some sort of impressionistic dry brush marks going. Then, as I said a little while ago, I really want this dry brush figure of the edge of the road sort of peeking in and out of visibility. To add a little bit of energy up into the painting. I just missed it here and there just to, so that it sort of comes in and out of focus again and doesn't take too much attention away from anything else. And I think, I always reserve the right to come back and mess it up further later, but I think for now, that is it. I'm going to call it a day. A little tempted to put some more character lines in the roadway this way, but also a little cautious to not overcook it. I know I'm going to do it though, so I may as well add 1 or 2. Let's see what they look like. For that, I'll just use a little cobalt. Yeah, not bad, but again, not sure it was needed. Soften it here and there. That's better. Yep, I think that's it. So there we go, a little sundown view in Ohio. This is Fairmont Road. I may tweak this a bit more as it dries, but I don't think, and I certainly hope I don't do much. It does look fairly luminous and fresh, and I wanted, that is what I was after as far as a finish. So thank you all for watching, and there'll be more to come. So happy painting, be well, and talk to you all soon.